Marie Marone was a restless suburban housewife.
She craved sex outside of her marriage.
She found what she was looking for when a chance encounter brought a young bad boy named Vasquez into her life and into her bed.
The two of them were having absolutely mind-blowing sex together.
But when the lovers' thrill ride spiraled out of control, the consequences would be deadly.
It was a very bloody crime scene.
The brutal, vicious murder.
Now go behind the scenes of a grisly investigation that would take detectives over 10 years to unravel and discover the terrifying truth behind a couple driven to fulfill their desires, no matter the cost.
He did not stop stabbing her until it was done, until he knew for sure she was dead.
We never had dealt with that type of violence before. You watch it on TV, you don't live it.
Denver, Colorado, June 23, 2000. It was a quiet Friday morning, and a home care nurse had just arrived for a scheduled appointment at the apartment of her patient, Renee Ely.
She had been bedridden, hospitalized, operation after operation. She was young, she was 36 years old.
Renee suffered from the autoimmune disease lupus and required frequent care, so her nurse had her own key to the apartment. After she let herself in, she called out to let Renee know she was there, but she got no response. Worried, the nurse walked into Renee's living room, where she found a horrifying scene.
Renee was lying in a pool of her own blood.
Police and paramedics arrived at the apartment moments later.
She was pronounced dead. It was very obvious that it was a homicide.
She had 21 stab wounds, including the stabs to her torso and neck.
But who had killed Renee, and why? The savage attack suggested that this murder had been deeply personal.
They said that it was a crime of passion.
But the viciousness of the crime scene couldn't prepare detectives for what lay ahead, or the twisted story of obsession that would unmask two killers whose depravity knew no limits. Born in 1972, Marie Marone grew up in a middle-class family in Missouri. But Marie's childhood was far from ideal, especially when it came to her relationship with her stepfather.
Marie has stated that the stepfather sexually abused her from the time she was a very young child.
Marie was too afraid to tell her mother what was going on, so she suffered in silence for years, dreaming of the day she could escape. By the time she'd turned 17, she couldn't wait any longer.
As soon as she thought she could take care of herself, she moved out.
To support herself, Marie wanted a job that would bring in good money. But as a young woman with little education and no experience, her prospects were limited. So she decided to use her youth and looks to her advantage and started working as an exotic dancer. The club where Marie worked was popular with a more upscale clientele, and she reveled in the money and attention thrown at her by its patrons.
Because she was abused physically and sexually, ultimately she felt more comfortable in a position of power, controlling and manipulating men.
Her late teens and early 20s was kind of a whirlwind for her. She did a lot of drugs and slept with a lot of men.
That is, until a handsome young musician named Joe Marone came into Marie's club one night and changed her life.
Joe's different. He was interested in her as a person. He wanted to know what she liked and what she was into and what she wanted out of life. And this made her feel important.
Their relationship developed quickly, and Marie began to wonder if there was more to life than stripping and one-night stands.
For the first time, Marie's actually starting to think about settling down. A part of her kind of wants the family and the white picket fence.
With Joe, Marie saw a chance to start a new life and to finally create the stable home she'd never had growing up. So when Joe proposed, Marie said yes. Over the next several years, the couple built a family together, moving to Denver, Colorado, where they had a baby. Marie got a job as a desk clerk at a hotel and settled into her new roles of wife and mother.
She was really trying to build a good, stable life.
Marie's come really far. She's left her dysfunctional life behind, and together she and Joe have kids and house and marriage, and their future looks pretty bright.
After 6 years of marriage, it seemed Marie had gotten everything she could ever hope for. But all of that would change when she met an attractive young man in the hotel lobby named Marone-Vasquez.
John was a lot younger than her, but he had this kind of quiet confidence that she found very intriguing.
Marie can't take her eyes off of him.
Born in 1982, John Vasquez was raised in New York, and like Marie, his early childhood had been less than ideal.
John had a very chaotic upbringing. His parents weren't around a whole lot. I don't think his dad was ever in the picture. His mom was in and out of his life.
With no one around to look after him, John quickly learned how to take care of himself, but it also left him with a chip on his shoulder.
John Vasquez had resentment over the fact that his mother wasn't there.
By the time John was 16, his angry and reckless attitude had earned him a reputation both on the street and with police.
By this point, he's committing crimes like theft and burglary, whatever he can do to make a quick buck.
John spent his teenage years in and out of juvenile detention. Then at age 18, he decided he needed a fresh start in a new city and moved to Denver, where his sister Carmen lived. John quickly discovered that in Colorado, many girls his age were naturally attracted to his East Coast street cred. But it was an older woman who caught John's attention, 28-year-old Marie Marone.
They met at a hotel in Aurora. John's sister Carmen worked there, as did Marie.
To John, Marie's very different. Marie's older, she's got more experience. She was a stripper, so she's got her own stories to tell.
Marie could tell that John was the kind of young man who did whatever he wanted, no matter the consequences. It was a quality she was immediately drawn to, and she soon began to feel something stirring in her that she hadn't felt in years.
Marie develops a little crush on John, and she starts flirting with him.
Over the next few weeks, Marie's flirtation with John continued to heat up. For Marie, spending time with John reminded her of what life had been like before marriage and responsibility. And while she thought she'd been ready to settle down, being a wife and mother wasn't enough for her anymore. She missed the excitement and adventure of her days working in the strip club, and that was something John was uniquely suited to give her.
John really knew how to party, and they were smoking a lot of pot and doing other drugs, and for Marie, it was just like the good old days.
She's starting to make all sorts of excuses to work late, but really, she's hanging out with John and getting high.
And for John, having an older woman like Marie showering him with attention was particularly satisfying.
Marie was that mother figure that he lacked growing up.
Marie was older, she was married, she had kids. He's younger, a good-looking guy. They were attracted because of that dynamic.
Marie knew that having an affair would mean risking the life she'd worked so hard to achieve, but her lust was too strong to resist. One day while John was visiting Marie at work, she decided to throw caution to the wind. While she was supposed to be working, Marie snuck John into an empty hotel room instead.
The two of them were having absolutely mind-blowing sex together. These two became sort of locked together. It was very intense.
And it really ignited their chemistry, and so things took off very, very quickly.
The couple began an impassioned affair. Marie became addicted to the rush she felt, sneaking around with a younger man, and John was more than happy to let her take the reins.
Being with John not only gave her that sense of excitement, but she loved feeling in control again.
But Marie knew she couldn't lead a double life forever. Faced with the choice between her stable, supportive husband and reliving her youth with an exhilarating lover, Marie made a shocking decision.
She becomes so obsessed with this new relationship that she leaves her husband and moves in with John.
You have two personalities that lack stability. Then you add in drugs and alcohol, and it's just a fire igniting.
A fire that was growing out of control. And it would soon engulf both the lovers and their community in a white-hot tale of obsession, deceit, and murder. Coming up, detectives at the crime scene uncover a clue the killer left behind.
They found one distinct boot print in the blood.
And investigators learn about a mysterious pair of witnesses who visited Renee the night she died.
They were the last people to see Renee alive.
When 28-year-old wife and mother Marie Marone fell for 18-year-old John Vasquez, he'd given her back the sense of excitement that had been missing from her life. And Marie had been willing to give up everything to be with him. But while the lovers were letting their passion run wild, police in Denver, Colorado were dealing with the aftermath of a horrific crime.
On June 23, 2000, a caregiver came to Renee Ely's home, opened the door, and saw a horrible, bloody scene.
This woman had been stabbed 19 or 20 times.
I got a phone call from my cousin, and she was like, they killed her, they killed Aunt May. And I was just overwhelmed with emotions.
The savage nature of the crime convinced detectives that Renee's murder hadn't been a random act of violence, a theory that seemed to be backed up by the fact that there were no signs of a break-in.
No forced entry is an indication that the victim either was negligent and left their doors unlocked, or more likely knew the individual that killed them.
In the kitchen, police found a piece of evidence the killer seemed to have left behind.
They found one distinct boot print in the blood, enough to give them a general size for the boot.
The shoe print had the potential to identify Renee's killer, but first police needed a suspect to match it to. Detectives turned to the nurse who found Renee's body, but she couldn't imagine anyone who would want to hurt her well-loved patient. She did, however, provide police with a potential motive when she described Renee's unique medical condition.
She had both rheumatoid arthritis and lupus.
Due to the severity of her pain, she was prescribed a lot of pain medications.
In the months prior to her murder, she had actually had to fill around 80 prescription pain medications.
Police knew that much pain medication would have a huge resale value on the streets. That would make Renee a tempting target for someone in need of cash. And that's exactly what appeared to have taken place.
All of her prescription pain medications had been emptied.
She was missing 180 pills. That would be somewhere between $500 and $1,000 on the street.
But that wasn't all. In Renee's bedroom, police found something else her killer had left behind.
On a bedsheet, there was a blood stain between the mattress and the box spring. And this blood stain was like a partial handprint.
Police theorized the killer might have left the handprint when bending down to check under Renee's bed. And if they had been looking for something in particular, it was gone now.
People hide stuff all the time in various places throughout a house. But in this case, it seems like the killer knew exactly where to go, right under that mattress.
When detectives interviewed Renee's family, they were devastated. But like her nurse, they couldn't think of anyone who would have harmed her.
My auntie, she didn't have any enemies. She was very peaceful. So just looking over her life, we just did not know anybody that would want to harm Renee.
With no leads, detectives canvassed Renee's apartment building to learn which neighbors knew about her stockpile of pain medications. They quickly discovered that Renee's stash wasn't a secret. Everyone knew about Renee's medicine supply, and Renee wasn't shy about sharing her surplus.
They called her the pill lady. My bag's hurting, Renee, I'm sick. She gave them pills, but it wasn't like she was sitting up there running this narcotic business.
Renee's neighbors also told police that the drugs weren't the only things her killer might have been after.
Renee did not save money in a bank, but rather when she had money, she would buy money orders with it and place them in a box.
When police checked, there was no box under the bed. And that makes them think that that was probably what the killer was looking for.
She was missing about $4,000 in money orders.
But that wasn't all that Renee's neighbors revealed. Apparently, Renee had a visitor drop by her apartment the night before her body had been discovered. Several neighbors recognized the visitor as a former resident of the apartment complex. Her name was Marie Marone, and Marie had shown up at Renee's apartment in the company of a young man that one witness identified as Marie's boyfriend, John Vasquez.
It appears that John and Marie were the last people to see Renee alive.
Detectives tracked Marie and John down at their apartment and brought them in for questioning, placing them in separate interrogation rooms. Marie confirmed she was Renee's friend, and she seemed genuinely shocked to learn of her death.
You guys came to my house because of murder?
Yeah, somebody was killed last night. Do you know who would want to hurt Renee?
Oh,
You know anybody who'd want to hurt?
Marie explained that she and Renee first became friends when she and her family lived in the apartment next door. In fact, Marie said that they'd grown so close that Renee was one of the only people she'd told about her affair with John Vasquez.
Renee Ely met Marie Marone when Marie lived in the same apartment building, and they were friends.
She was that friend that was always knocking at my aunt's door. She was always there. We'd be like, do you go home? Do you have a husband?
Despite her secrecy, Marie told police that her husband had eventually discovered the affair, and it spelled the end of her marriage.
This interaction led to a divorce. She was no longer living with him and went to John Vasquez's residence.
And since their romance was no longer a secret, she and John were free to spend all their time together. Marie took John everywhere, even to see her old friend Renee, who Marie said she would visit and help out whenever she could. And that's exactly what she claimed she and John were doing when they visited Renee's apartment complex the night before she died.
They had cooked Renee dinner and done some chores for her, hung out with her for a little while.
Marie told police that they all enjoyed a quiet evening together, and after a few hours, she and John had gone home. Meanwhile, John was telling police an identical story in his interrogation room across the hall.
They were just close friends, having dinner together, no reason to suspect anything.
But as detectives continued their interviews with John and Marie, they noticed something that concerned them.
Put your hands out like this.
They saw that John had a cut on his hand.
Where'd you get this cut at?
John told detectives that he'd gotten the cut while using a knife to prepare dinner for Marie and Renee.
That's a pretty fresh cut.
Very fresh, and he just opened up this morning when I took a shower.
Oh, it did?
But police couldn't help but wonder if John's knife wound might have had more sinister origins.
You see a lot of times in stabbing cases, the knife will slip down and they'll cut themselves on their fingers, on their palms. And he had a cut right on his palm where you'd expect somebody to perhaps get a cut if they were stabbing somebody like this.
Between the suspicious wound and the fact that the lovers had been the last people seen entering Renee's apartment, police were convinced that John and Marie were their best suspects in the murder. But the lovers insisted they had nothing to do with Renee's death, and both agreed to take polygraph tests to prove their innocence.
Indications were that they both passed and were not being deceptive and were cleared from the investigation.
Denver police found themselves back at square one, having just lost their best and only suspects in the murder. Convinced that John and Marie were telling the truth, detectives told them they were free to go. But before they left, the couple told police they did have something they hoped might help the investigation.
John and Marie told police that they knew someone who had threatened to kill Renee.
Coming up, investigators discover that Marie and John weren't the only ones to stop by Renee's apartment that night.
He forced his way into the residence and then had an argument with Renee Ely.
And a surprising tip gives police the break they've been hoping for.
He had killed before, and he gave specific details.
28-year-old Marie Marone had sacrificed her comfortable life as a suburban housewife and mother to pursue a steamy romance with her 18-year-old lover, John Vasquez.
You basically have this woman who's living with her family out in the burbs. And then there's this street punk, and the two of them are having this out-of-control affair.
Marie and John's relationship ignited very quickly, and it was really intoxicating for both of them.
However, the lovers' wild thrill ride had been derailed when Marie's friend Renee Ely was found brutally murdered inside her apartment.
This was a passionate murder where, a woman was stabbed 21 times.
John and Marie had briefly come under suspicion because they'd been at Renee's apartment hours before she was murdered. But they'd both submitted to polygraph tests to prove their innocence.
Both passed, and so they were not viewed as being suspects.
But before the couple left the police station, they told detectives they weren't the only ones who'd been over to Renee's apartment that night. After dinner, John was cleaning up the kitchen while Renee and Marie visited in the living room. All of a sudden, there was a banging on the door. But before they had a chance to answer it, a man came barging inside.
All of a sudden, here's this guy named Ali. Turns out he's the ex-boyfriend of Renee.
Ali was known to have a temper.
Ali forced his way into the residence and then had an argument with Renee Ely that caused Renee Ely to cry.
John and Marie said they finally had to step in and told Ali that if he didn't leave, they would call the police. Ali left, but not before delivering a parting shot that John and Marie now wished they'd taken more seriously.
He says he's gonna make her pay. This isn't the end of it.
She was afraid that if Ali ever came back, he would assault her.
When police ran a background check on Ali, they learned he was more than capable of making good on his threats to Renee.
They discover that he's got a criminal record. He's this erratic, crazy kind of person, volatile.
Police tracked down Ali and brought him in for an interview. But Ali said that John and Marie were lying. He said he didn't go to Renee's apartment that night. Ali claimed he hadn't seen or spoken to Renee in weeks, and that he'd moved on to someone new.
He claimed that he was with his girlfriend. It was his alibi.
But between his violent past and the statement from Marie and John, investigators weren't simply going to take Ali at his word. So police asked him to take a polygraph test. Ali agreed.
Ali was given a polygraph test. He failed the polygraph test.
Did that mean Ali was responsible for Renee's murder? Since a failed polygraph alone wasn't enough to file murder charges, detectives knew they needed more evidence.
At this point, they decided to search Ali's apartment.
And investigators soon found something they thought might link Ali to the crime scene: his shoes.
They found a bloody shoe print in the kitchen, so we knew that whoever left that shoe print did it after Renee Ely was killed.
When crime scene analysts looked at the boot, they determined that it was a size 8.
Detectives compared the print to Ali's work shoes, but there was a problem.
Ali had a size 12, significant difference.
After all of that, it seems there's no evidence to link Ali to Renee's murder after all.
With nothing else for police to go on, the investigation into Renee Ely's death seemed to have reached a dead end.
Police, detectives ran down all their leads and didn't have a solid suspect.
It didn't lead them anywhere to anyone other than the people they had already looked at. With the passing of time, then the investigation became cold.
Years passed, and there isn't activity in this case.
Renee's murder remained unsolved for 10 years. Then, in 2011, detectives working in the Denver Police Department's cold case unit got an unexpected phone call from over 800 miles away.
There's this woman on the phone, and she's calling from Boise, Idaho.
The woman, Heather Farrar, told police that her daughter was involved in an abusive marriage and that her daughter's husband had made a terrifying threat.
Apparently told this woman that if she talked to police and told them what was going on, he threatened to kill her.
And what he told her next gave her plenty of reason to be terrified.
He'd killed before, and he gave specific details.
He had killed a woman named Renee back in Denver, and that he could do the same thing to her.
Coming up, a new crime gives detectives a lead in their cold case.
In both cases, a knife was used, and in both cases, drugs were stolen.
And a former suspect makes a shocking confession.
She screamed, "Help!" And I told her, "I can't help you."
By the fall of 2000, Marie Marone and John Vasquez were consumed by their insatiable affair, indulging their every passion and giving in to their basest desires.
They had an interest in exciting or dangerous experiences, and they were experiencing them together.
But their good times had come to a shocking end when a mutual friend, 36-year-old Renee Ely, was found brutally stabbed to death.
Investigators thought that it was a crime of hate or a crime of passion.
We never had dealt with that type of violence before. Never. Like, you watch it on TV, you don't live it.
But after exhausting every lead, the case had gone cold. And for 10 years, it looked like Renee's death would go unsolved. Until 2011, when investigators got an unexpected tip from a woman who said her daughter's abusive husband had made a startling confession.
He threatened her, and the way he did it was by mentioning he'd killed before.
He told her that the name of that woman was Renee. That had occurred in Denver, Colorado.
The husband's name turned out to be one that detectives had heard before, 10 years before.
The man who did this is named John Vasquez.
It seemed that somewhere along the line, John and Marie parted ways, and he'd gotten married. But police knew that both John Vasquez and Marie Marone had already been cleared as suspects in Renee's murder after passing polygraph tests 10 years earlier. Was it possible detectives had made a mistake?
It's not impossible to trick the polygraph test, and so law enforcement was wondering if John and Marie had figured out a way to do that.
When police ran background checks on the couple, they discovered that before John and Marie broke up, they'd had another brush with the law. It turned out that the couple's hard partying lifestyle had involved a lot more than just smoking pot together, and it had eventually gotten them into serious trouble.
They were using cocaine, they were after cocaine. It seemed like they were on this ride together, and all caution to the wind.
Marie and John were so focused on having a good time that paying their bills became a big problem.
Marie had been forging checks in order to pay debts, including a $200 debt for drugs.
But they hadn't stopped at writing bad checks. The couple had also resorted to a more violent crime.
They committed a robbery together after Renee Ely was killed.
In 2002, the couple had been arrested and charged with armed robbery after stealing money and drugs from a Denver pot dealer.
John Vasquez grabbed a knife from inside the apartment and started to threaten him, started to poke him. Marie was yelling at John, kind of egging him on.
To police, the similarities between the drug dealer robbery and the murder of Renee Ely were alarming.
In both cases, a knife was used, and in both cases, drugs were stolen.
When John and Marie were arrested for the robbery, detectives were no longer pursuing the homicide investigation, so the connection between the two crimes had never been made until now.
If they committed armed robbery once, they could certainly do it again. And so at this point, investigators put these two back at the top of the list of suspects in Renee Ely's murder.
A review of the robbery case also made it clear why John and Marie had broken up.
Marie testified against John. In court, John was sent to prison.
John served 4 years, while Marie was only sentenced to probation.
That ended their relationship. From that point on, the couple didn't have any more contact.
Detectives now wondered if the bad blood between Marie and John might work in their favor. If the lovers were involved in Renee's murder, would John implicate Marie in order to get back at her for testifying against him in his robbery case?
Denver police traveled to Boise and they brought John in for an interrogation.
But they discovered that despite Marie's betrayal, John wasn't interested in cooperating with their investigation.
My story is not changing. I didn't do anything wrong then, and I haven't done anything wrong now.
You have told people that I can prove that we're not there that night, that intimate details about that scene, and about what took place that night.
I couldn't have told anybody any details that I don't know.
John wasn't budging from his original statement, but detectives now had access to a crucial piece of evidence that had gone unnoticed 10 years earlier, when John and Marie passed their polygraph tests.
When they checked John's shoe size, they found out it was the same size as the bloody footprint in Renee's kitchen, size 8.
The bloody shoe print supported their suspicions that John had been involved in the murder. But since John wasn't willing to talk, investigators decided to try Marie instead. Detectives tracked her down in Wyoming and sat down for an interview.
Marie was living in Cheyenne, Wyoming. She had married yet again.
She and her new husband had children together, so Marie was almost back to the life she had before she met John.
Just as they hoped, once police told Marie what they knew, she seemed eager to protect herself and her new life.
It's immediately apparent to the officers that she's very nervous about this.
I'll do anything and everything to keep my children safe.
Then you need to explain it to us. You need to tell us what happened.
Marie told detectives that at first, the affair with John seemed like the cure to her unhappiness.
He was a youngster, but at that time in my life, I was in I guess you want to say a limbo.
But the more they amped up their relationship, the further it seemed John wanted to take it.
John was the one who introduced crack cocaine into their relationship, and that he was the one who encouraged her to do prescription drugs, and that he was the one who was always seeking the next high, and she just followed along.
And when Marie introduced John to Renee, her stash of prescription drugs provided him with an opportunity that was too good to pass up.
He took her medicine because he told me on the streets you can sell this medicine and you can get a lot of money off of it.
Marie said she was reluctant to abuse her friendship with Renee, but as John's cocaine and prescription drug use intensified, he began to show a darker side that made her afraid to cross him.
John had violent tendencies. He, at various times, had assaulted Marie. The former husband told us on another occasion he went over there to pick the children up, and John threatened to kill him.
When we got to fighting, he said he was going to get some lighter fluid and burn us up in there.
Were you fighting with him?
At that point, right then and that time, yeah.
But that wasn't the only reason Marie came to fear John. Marie told police that one night while they were getting high together, John revealed a dark fantasy.
John had talked about what it would be like to kill someone.
He really wanted to do that, and he wanted to have that experience.
Marie told police that John's confession shocked her. and she tried to put the conversation out of her mind.
She probably convinced herself that it was just the drugs talking. There's no way he could have been serious.
Then, on the night of June 22nd, John suggested they cook dinner for Renee. Marie thought that was a great idea, but she didn't know that John was about to make his fantasy a reality. Marie told police that Renee had never approved of her cheating on her husband with John, and after dinner, she made the mistake of speaking her mind.
Okay, so she tells you you should go back to your husband. What happens after that?
They just started bickering more, and that's when he got up, walked behind her. I thought he was getting something to drink, you know? And that's when he grabbed the knife out of the drawer.
Marie said she watched in horror as John used the knife to try and slit Renee's throat.
John came up behind Renee, grabbed her hair, pulling her head back, and then running the knife around her neck.
But the cut only sent Renee into a panic. She started screaming, and Marie told police that at that point, something in John seemed to snap.
I saw him stab her over and over and over and over. I did go puke because I'd never seen like this before, okay? When I came back out, he was stabbing her. She screamed, help, and I told her, I can't help you.
Where was she when she screamed help?
On the ground. She's like, Maria, help.
Where was he?
Stabbing her. He did not stop stabbing her until it was done, until he knew for sure she was dead.
When it was over, Marie said the look on John's face chilled her to the bone.
Marie says that John is smiling. He's almost giddy with excitement.
Something that'll be with you for the rest of your life.
It's been with me. I have to literally take sleeping pills just to sleep.
Marie told police she sat in shock as John emptied Renee's pill stash and stole the money orders and cash from underneath her mattress. Then he made her swear never to tell anyone what had happened, or she'd be next.
Maybe I had snitchment on my forehead at that moment. I don't know. But he looked at me and he said, don't you say a damn thing, bitch, or I'll kill you.
But detectives wondered, did the murder happen the way Marie described it? Or was she more involved than she claimed to be? Had the brutal stabbing been another fantasy this thrill-seeking couple acted out together?
Your boyfriend is stabbing this frail woman who is supposed to be your really close friend. He's stabbing her to death, and you're telling me that you just sat there and did nothing?
From what investigators had learned about the couple, Marie had been the one in control of the relationship, and the way she'd incited John to violence in their previous armed robbery suggested she might have gotten just as much of a thrill from the grisly murder as John. Although police couldn't prove she'd been a willing accomplice, Marie's statement was enough to place both of the lovers under arrest. But little did prosecutors know that the truth behind this deadly romance had yet to be revealed. Coming up, a shocking new theory and a courtroom conspiracy.
This was just a case about ex-wives and ex-girlfriends who didn't like John Vasquez and were trying to convict him.
All of these women were out for revenge.
Nearly 10 years after their tumultuous affair ended, Marie Marone and John Vasquez had finally been charged with the brutal murder of their mutual friend, 36-year-old Renee Ely. In October of 2012, John Vasquez's trial began in Colorado. Prosecutors called a series of witnesses, including John's former lovers, who testified that John often bragged about murdering Renee to intimidate them.
He was bragging and saying, I killed this woman before, I can kill you too.
The prosecution also had two key pieces of evidence tying John to the scene. First was the bloody shoe print found near Renee Ely's body.
It was a size 8 shoe, which wound up being the same size that John Vasquez wore.
But even more damning was the blood found on Renee's bedsheets. Samples of the bloody handprint had been sent to the lab for testing, and the results were conclusive.
It was positively determined that that blood was John Vasquez's.
John's defense maintained that he cut his hand while cooking dinner for Renee, and they claimed that there was an innocent explanation as to how his blood ended up on Renee's sheet.
He had routinely cared for Renee, and he had cleaned her apartment. So an explanation for that is that he was making the bed.
John's attorneys argued that he wasn't a killer, but he was abusive towards women, and they believed that was what had landed him on trial for murder. They claimed that the charges against John were the result of a conspiracy by his ex-lovers, including Marie Marone.
This was just a case about ex-wives and ex-girlfriends who didn't like John Vasquez and were trying to convict him.
His defense is that all of these women were out for revenge.
But would the jury believe that John had been framed? The court wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. On October 25th, the jury announced their verdict. John Vasquez was found guilty of first-degree murder.
John is sentenced to life in prison without parole.
With John's trial a success, prosecutors were ready to set their sights on Marie. But on the day her trial was to begin, she made a startling announcement.
Her attorneys came forward and stated that she would plead guilty.
After watching her former lover get a life sentence, Marie worried she would face the same fate at trial, so she agreed to a plea.
Marie Marone pled to second-degree murder.
She got 40 years in prison.
After 10 long years, Renee's loved ones had finally gotten the justice they'd been praying for.
She was my light. She was my air. She was my peace. Because she always had an answer for everything I was going through.
John and Marie might have shared a taste for danger and excitement, but when his reckless and violent personality came in contact with her need to control, the result had been unimaginable.
I would compare John to a stick of dynamite. Very explosive, but requiring something to trigger it. I believe that Marie put the fuse into that stick of dynamite.
On the night of January 6th, 1994, the city of New Orleans was settling into the quiet hours that arrive only after the music has faded and the crowds have drifted away from the narrow streets of the French Quarter. Along the banks of the Mississippi River, the air was damp. The current moved relentlessly through the darkness, and the lights reflecting on the water offered only the illusion of calm. It was an ordinary winter night for the city. There were no flashing police lights, no frantic search parties, no indication that within hours one of Italy's most enduring mysteries would begin. Somewhere near the river, a young woman was seen sitting alone. She appeared calm, almost detached, staring into the water as though searching for something beyond the reach of anyone standing on the shore. A security guard named Albert Cordova approached her, believing she should not remain so close to the edge of the river at night. According to his later statement, he asked the young woman to leave the area. Instead of moving away, she reportedly answered with a sentence that would become one of the most haunting phrases ever associated with a missing person investigation. "I belong in water." Moments later, according to his account, she entered the Mississippi River. At first, she seemed capable of swimming. Then she began struggling against the current. Before any rescue could reach her, the river swallowed her into the darkness. Emergency responders searched the water. The Coast Guard became involved. The river was examined, but no body was ever recovered. Even today, investigators cannot state with certainty that the woman Albert Cordova encountered was Ilenia Carisi. There is no photograph, no video recording, no physical evidence linking her to that final encounter. There is only a witness's memory, preserved in official records and repeated for decades, standing alone against the silence left behind by the river. That uncertainty transformed what might have appeared to be a tragic drowning into one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern Italian history. Because if the woman on the riverbank was not Ilenia, then where did she go? And if she was Ilenia, why has no trace of her ever been found? Missing person investigations are often defined not by what investigators discover, but by what they never do. A crime scene can reveal fingerprints, bloodstains, DNA, weapons, surveillance footage, or eyewitnesses whose accounts intersect to form a coherent narrative. A disappearance offers no such certainty. Instead, it creates a void. Every unanswered question becomes another possible explanation. Every missing piece of evidence allows multiple theories to survive side by side, none strong enough to eliminate the others. In some cases, that uncertainty lasts weeks. In others, months or years. For the Carisi family, it has lasted decades. Ilenia Maria Sol Carisi was only 23 years old when she disappeared. To much of the world, she was known first as the eldest daughter of two internationally celebrated Italian singers, Albinu Carisi and Romina Power. Growing up in a family recognized across Europe meant that public attention surrounded her from childhood. Yet the fame attached to her family would eventually become one of the very things she hoped to leave behind. Rather than embrace celebrity, she chose another path. She studied literature, dreamed of writing, and eventually decided to travel independently, seeking experiences that could not be found behind cameras or concert stages. Her journey would take her across Central America before arriving in New Orleans near the end of 1993. It should have been one chapter in a much longer adventure. Instead, it became the final confirmed destination in her life. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance only deepened the mystery. Before vanishing, Ilenia had been staying at a hotel with a street musician named Alexander Masakila, a man significantly older than she was. He later told investigators that they had shared a room but slept in separate beds, and that she had left the hotel alone. When police examined the situation more closely, they discovered that Masakila had a criminal history involving drugs and violence. They also learned that after Ilenia disappeared, he continued staying at the hotel and at one point attempted to use her traveler's checks to pay for his room. Those discoveries naturally drew investigators' attention toward him. Yet suspicion alone cannot replace evidence. There was no confirmed crime scene, no forensic evidence, no witness who observed an assault, and no body. Without those elements, prosecutors had nothing that could establish criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation, therefore, remained suspended between possibility and proof. At the same time, the reported encounter beside the Mississippi River suggested an entirely different explanation. If the witness had indeed seen Ilenia, perhaps no crime had occurred at all. Perhaps she had entered the river voluntarily. Yet this theory was burdened by its own unanswered questions. Rivers as large and powerful as the Mississippi can conceal evidence. But the complete absence of physical remains has continued to challenge investigators and family members alike. Without a body, medical examiners could determine no cause of death. Without DNA, no forensic conclusions could be reached. Without confirmation that the woman at the river was actually Ilenia, the entire account remained an unresolved possibility rather than an established fact. As years passed, additional theories emerged. Some believed she had been murdered. Others suggested she had chosen to disappear intentionally and begin a new life under another identity. Rumors placed her in distant locations, including Arizona and South America. Each report generated temporary hope, only to collapse under investigation. Every lead ultimately returned detectives to the same point. There was no verified evidence showing that Ilenia Carisi had ever been seen again after early January 1994. Even speculation connecting her disappearance to a known serial killer would eventually be dismissed, after DNA testing excluded the possibility. One by one, explanations appeared promising before yielding to the same obstacle that had defined the case from the beginning: the absence of proof. For her family, uncertainty became its own form of tragedy. Unlike families who receive confirmation, however painful, those left behind by disappearances are forced to live between hope and acceptance. Every unidentified body, every reported sighting, every anonymous tip can reopen emotional wounds that never had the chance to heal completely. In Eilenia's case, this uncertainty would eventually divide even those closest to her. While one parent came to believe she had died in the Mississippi River, the other continued hoping she might still be alive somewhere in the world. Neither belief could be conclusively proven. Neither could be disproven. Decades later, an Italian court would declare Eilenia legally dead, a decision intended to resolve legal matters rather than establish historical certainty. The declaration answered paperwork. It did not answer the mystery. No remains have ever been identified as hers. No one has ever been charged in connection with her disappearance. No court has determined how she died, or even whether she died on that January night. The case remains officially unresolved, preserved in investigative files and public memory alike. This is not a story about a solved crime or a courtroom verdict that brought clarity. It is a story about uncertainty, about the limits of investigation when evidence disappears alongside the person investigators are trying to find. It is the story of a young woman who walked away from a life of fame in search of independence, only to vanish in a city thousands of miles from home. It is the story of a witness whose words continue to echo across more than 3 decades, of a river that surrendered no answers, and of a family left to navigate the impossible space between hope and grief. As we retrace the known facts of Eilenia Carisi's final journey, one reality remains unchanged from the night she disappeared. Every theory raises new questions. Every clue carries uncertainty, and the truth has remained hidden, somewhere beyond the reach of everyone who has searched for it. Long before her name became synonymous with one of Italy's most enduring unsolved disappearances, Eilenia Maria Sol Carisi was simply a young woman searching for a life that belonged to her alone. History would remember her through the mystery of her final days. But understanding that mystery requires beginning somewhere entirely different, not on the banks of the Mississippi River, not inside a hotel room in New Orleans, and not amid decades of unanswered questions. It begins in a world defined by fame, expectation, and public attention, where every success was celebrated by millions and every private moment carried the possibility of becoming public knowledge. Eilenia was born on November 29, 1970, the eldest daughter of 2 of Italy's most recognizable musical figures, Albinu Carisi and Romina Power. Their careers had earned them international recognition, making them one of Europe's best-known entertainment couples. For many observers, they represented glamour, artistic success, and family unity. Their performances reached audiences across continents, and their names became familiar to countless households. From the outside, their lives appeared extraordinary. Yet for a child growing up inside that environment, extraordinary often meant something very different. It meant living beneath constant attention, where one's identity could easily become overshadowed by the reputation of one's parents. As the oldest child, Eilenia entered a world in which expectations already existed before she had the opportunity to define herself. People recognized her surname long before they knew her personality. Newspapers and television programs were interested not only in the careers of her parents, but also in their family. Although the available records concerning her personal life remain limited, one fact consistently emerges from accounts of those years. Eilenia did not appear interested in simply following the path that had been laid before her. She was not remembered as someone eager to capitalize on celebrity. Instead, the verified information suggests that she sought independence, intellectual growth, and experiences beyond the boundaries of fame. Those ambitions became increasingly evident as she grew older. Rather than pursuing the entertainment industry, she focused on education. She enrolled at King's College London, where she studied literature and earned a reputation for strong academic performance. Literature was more than an academic discipline. It represented a way of understanding people, cultures, and the countless stories that shape human experience. Writers often search for truth by observing the world directly rather than accepting secondhand narratives. And Eilenia appeared drawn toward that same philosophy. She excelled in her studies, demonstrating both intellectual curiosity and dedication. Friends and family would later describe her as someone eager to explore ideas, cultures, and perspectives beyond the environment in which she had grown up. Academic success alone, however, did not satisfy her ambitions. At some point during 1993, Eilenia made a decision that would redefine the course of her life. Rather than settling into a conventional career immediately after her studies, she chose something far less predictable. According to the verified information available, she sold nearly all of her possessions. It was not an impulsive decision described as an escape from immediate danger or personal crisis. Instead, it reflected a deliberate commitment to a long journey around the world. She intended to travel extensively, collecting experiences that she hoped would eventually become the foundation for a novel. The decision was significant in several ways. First, it demonstrated a willingness to leave behind material comfort in exchange for personal experience. Selling most of one's belongings is not merely a logistical step before traveling. It represents a conscious simplification of life, reducing attachment to possessions in favor of movement and discovery. Second, the journey reflected her desire to create something meaningful through writing. Rather than documenting famous concerts or celebrity lifestyles, she wanted to experience ordinary places and meet ordinary people whose stories could inspire literature. For someone who had spent much of her life associated with fame, that aspiration carried particular significance. She appeared to value authenticity over recognition. The route she chose eventually took her through Central America. Among the places specifically documented in the available evidence was Belize, where she spent part of her travels before continuing northward. The journey itself remains only partially documented in public records, and it is important not to invent details where none exist. What is known is that after spending time in Central America, Eilenia traveled by bus toward the United States, arriving in New Orleans near the end of December 1993. The city was unlike almost anywhere else in North America, known for its music, historic streets, diverse cultures, and vibrant public life. New Orleans has long attracted travelers seeking experiences unavailable elsewhere. For someone interested in observing humanity and gathering material for future writing, it may have seemed a natural destination. Yet while the city would become central to the mystery surrounding her disappearance, there is no verified evidence describing precisely what she hoped to accomplish during her stay beyond continuing her broader journey. Upon arriving in New Orleans, Eilenia encountered a man who would later become one of the most scrutinized figures in the investigation, Alexander Masekela. Public attention has often transformed him into a figure surrounded by speculation. But the verified facts are considerably narrower than many later rumors suggest. Masekela was a street musician approximately 20 years older than Eilenia. At some point after meeting, the two shared a room at the Ludale Hotel. According to Masekela's own account, they slept in separate beds. There is no verified evidence contradicting or confirming that statement. It remains simply part of his testimony to investigators. Their decision to share accommodations may have reflected practical considerations common among budget travelers. But the investigation never established the precise nature of their relationship beyond the facts that they stayed in the same hotel room and spent time together before Eilenia disappeared. At first glance, the arrangement might not have appeared particularly unusual within the context of independent travel. Backpackers often encounter strangers from different countries, share transportation, exchange travel advice, and occasionally split lodging costs. Such circumstances alone do not imply criminal intent or inappropriate conduct. It was only after Eilenia vanished that investigators began examining every aspect of those final known days in detail. Every conversation, every movement, every decision suddenly acquired new significance because there were so few confirmed facts available. Before her disappearance, however, there was nothing publicly documented to indicate that police or anyone else viewed the situation as extraordinary. As the final days of 1993 came to an end, Eilenia remained in contact with her family. The last confirmed communication occurred during a telephone call on New Year's Eve. Although the contents of that conversation have never become a central piece of publicly verified evidence, its importance lies in what it represents. It established the last undisputed moment in which her family knew she was alive. At the time, there would have been no reason for anyone involved to believe the conversation carried historic significance. Families speak to one another every day without imagining that ordinary words may later become precious because they were the last ones ever exchanged. Only in retrospect did that call assume extraordinary emotional weight. Following the New Year's holiday, Eilenia was reportedly seen in the French Quarter, the historic district famous for its distinctive architecture, music, and constant flow of visitors. These sightings helped investigators establish that she remained in New Orleans during the days immediately preceding her disappearance. Beyond those observations, however, the historical record grows increasingly limited. There is no verified diary describing her thoughts. No confirmed letters explain her plans. No documented interviews reveal what she intended to do next. Instead, investigators would later reconstruct her final days from scattered observations and witness accounts, each contributing only a small piece to a much larger puzzle. What makes Eilenia's background especially important is not simply the contrast between celebrity and anonymity, but the consistency of her choices. The available evidence portrays a young woman who repeatedly sought independence. She pursued higher education rather than relying on family fame. She chose literature over entertainment. She sold her possessions to finance travel rather than remaining within familiar surroundings. She crossed countries and cultures with the hope of transforming lived experience into creative work. None of those decisions suggest recklessness in themselves. Instead, they reveal someone motivated by curiosity and a desire to build an identity separate from public expectations. That makes the mystery of her disappearance all the more striking. Her journey was intended to produce stories, not become one. She left Italy in search of experience, carrying ambitions that centered on writing and exploration. Yet somewhere between the lively streets of New Orleans and the dark waters of the Mississippi River, the documented trail of her life came to an abrupt and unexplained end. Everything investigators would examine afterward, the hotel room, the belongings left behind, the witness statements, the theories, the suspicions, and the decades of unanswered questions, would ultimately revolve around a young traveler whose greatest known ambition had simply been to discover the world on her own terms. Before the mystery, before the investigation, before the headlines and speculation, there was only Eilenia Carisi, a 23-year-old literature student determined to step beyond the shadow of extraordinary parents and write her own story. Tragically, instead of becoming the author of that story, she became its greatest unanswered question. The final chapter of Ilenia Carisi's documented journey is remarkably short when compared to the decades of questions that followed. Investigators would spend years attempting to reconstruct only a handful of days, examining witness statements, hotel records, and every confirmed detail available. Yet despite the attention devoted to those last known movements, the sequence of events remains defined as much by uncertainty as by fact. There are moments that can be reasonably established, others that rely entirely on individual testimony, and finally a point beyond which the historical record simply disappears. It is within that narrow window during the first days of January 1994 that one of Italy's greatest unsolved mysteries began. As the final hours of 1993 approached, Ilenia was still maintaining contact with her family in Italy. On New Year's Eve, she spoke with them by telephone. This conversation would later become the final confirmed communication between Ilenia and those who knew her best. At the time, nothing suggested that it would be remembered as a farewell. Like countless family conversations exchanged across long distances, it was simply another call between a young traveler and her loved ones back home. No alarm was raised. No immediate concern emerged. She had spent months traveling independently through different countries, and maintaining occasional contact was entirely consistent with that lifestyle. Families of long-term travelers often accept periods of silence between conversations, particularly during international journeys. There is no obvious reason to believe that this phone call marked the end of all verified communication with her. After New Year's Eve, Ilenia remained in New Orleans. Witnesses reportedly saw her in and around the French Quarter, the city's historic neighborhood known for its narrow streets, old buildings, music, restaurants, and steady flow of visitors from around the world. During the holiday season, the district was especially lively. Street performers entertained crowds, travelers explored unfamiliar neighborhoods, and locals mixed with tourists from dozens of different countries. It was an environment where strangers crossed paths constantly, making brief encounters that would be forgotten almost immediately. For investigators, this presented both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, a busy district meant there were potentially many witnesses. On the other, identifying those witnesses weeks or months later became extraordinarily difficult. Most people who passed through the French Quarter had no reason to pay particular attention to a young Italian traveler they had never met before. Even if they had noticed her, memories fade quickly, especially when nothing appears unusual at the time. As a result, investigators were left with only limited confirmed sightings rather than a complete timeline of her daily activities. During these days, Ilenia was staying at the Loudale Hotel together with Alexander Masekela, the street musician she had met after arriving in New Orleans. According to Masekela's statement, the two shared a room but slept in separate beds. This point would later receive considerable attention because it represented one of the last confirmed circumstances in which Ilenia was known to have been living. However, investigators never established evidence contradicting or independently confirming his description of their arrangement. His statement, therefore, became one component of the broader investigation rather than a proven fact. According to his account, the final morning unfolded without obvious conflict or drama. He later told investigators that Ilenia left the hotel by herself. No verified evidence established that anyone accompanied her when she departed. If his account was accurate, then her final independent movements began at that moment. Yet this simple statement immediately created another problem for investigators. If she had indeed left alone, where exactly was she going? No confirmed witness could answer that question. No documented itinerary survived to explain her destination. No confirmed message revealed her plans. From that point onward, investigators could only reconstruct fragments of her movements through witness reports rather than continuous documentation. One of the most striking aspects of her departure involved what she did not take with her. According to the investigation, most of her luggage remained inside the hotel room. Her passport was left behind. Other personal belongings also stayed in the room. These details quickly became central to the investigation because they appeared unusual regardless of which theory investigators considered. For someone planning to continue international travel, leaving behind a passport would create immediate practical difficulties. For someone intending to disappear voluntarily and begin a completely new life, abandoning essential identification likewise raised difficult questions. Even investigators considering the possibility of accidental death or suicide recognized that these possessions represented important evidence, though they could not determine exactly what those items revealed about her intentions. The belongings remained silent, offering clues without explanations. After leaving the hotel, the confirmed trail grows increasingly uncertain. The most discussed account originates not from a friend or family member, but from a security guard named Albert Cordova. His testimony would eventually become one of the defining elements of the entire case, not because it conclusively solved the mystery, but because it presented the last known description of a woman who might have been Eilenia. According to Cordova, he was working near the Mississippi River during the evening of January 6, 1994. The river has always been central to New Orleans. It carries enormous volumes of water through the heart of the city, serving as both a commercial lifeline and a natural force capable of immense destruction. At night, especially during winter, its dark surface can appear almost motionless despite the powerful current flowing beneath. It was in this setting that Cordova noticed a young blonde woman sitting near the riverbank. Concerned about her proximity to the water, he approached and instructed her to leave the area. His account describes neither panic nor confrontation. Instead, he recalled a brief exchange that would become permanently associated with Eilenia's disappearance. According to his statement, the young woman responded with the words, "I belong in water." The sentence was short, simple, and deeply enigmatic. Investigators could not determine what she meant. The phrase has been interpreted in numerous ways over the years, but interpretations are not evidence. The only verified fact is that Cordova reported hearing those words before the woman entered the river. According to his testimony, she initially appeared capable of swimming. She moved some distance into the Mississippi before beginning to struggle. The river's current is powerful even for experienced swimmers, and darkness further complicates rescue efforts. Cordova stated that she was eventually carried away by the current before anyone could save her. Emergency authorities responded quickly. Police and the United States Coast Guard initiated search efforts along the river. Such operations are complex, requiring coordination across large areas because strong currents can carry bodies considerable distances. Despite these efforts, no remains were recovered. The search produced no physical evidence confirming the identity of the individual who had entered the water. This absence of evidence would become one of the greatest obstacles confronting investigators. Had a body been recovered, forensic examination might have established identity, cause of death, and potentially other crucial information. Instead, the investigation was forced to rely almost entirely upon witness testimony. An equally important limitation accompanied Cordova's statement. Although investigators considered his account significant, he could not positively identify the woman he encountered as Eilenia Carisi. He described a blonde woman near the river, but there was no photograph, no video recording, no personal belongings recovered at the scene, and no independent witness capable of confirming that the woman was indeed Eilenia. This distinction remains fundamental to understanding the case. Over the years, public discussion has often treated the river incident as though it unquestionably involved Eilenia. Officially, however, investigators never established that fact with certainty. The woman beside the Mississippi may have been Eilenia, but available evidence has never proven that conclusion beyond doubt. That uncertainty transformed the witness statement from a solution into another unresolved question. If the woman was Eilenia, then investigators faced the mystery of why no body was ever recovered. If she was not Eilenia, then investigators faced an even larger problem. The last confirmed trace of Eilenia disappeared somewhere else entirely. Every subsequent theory would be influenced by that uncertainty. Following the search, investigators attempted to reconstruct Eilenia's final movements as thoroughly as possible. They examined the timeline established through hotel records, witness interviews, and known locations. Yet each effort encountered the same limitation. Beyond her departure from the hotel and the disputed witness account near the river, there were no confirmed sightings establishing where she had gone or what had happened. No verified financial activity suggested continued travel. No confirmed use of identification documents occurred after her disappearance. No authenticated communication was ever received from her again. The documented trail simply ended. Such abrupt endings are exceptionally difficult for investigators. In homicide investigations, physical evidence often continues speaking long after the crime itself has occurred. In missing person cases, silence frequently becomes the dominant characteristic. Every missing document, every absent witness, every unexplained gap acquires enormous significance because there is so little else available. The investigation into Eilenia Carisi's disappearance would soon expand far beyond New Orleans, drawing attention from authorities in multiple countries and from a public fascinated by the disappearance of the daughter of internationally famous entertainers. Yet despite increasing attention, the essential facts surrounding those final days remain surprisingly few. A young woman arrived in New Orleans after months of international travel. She stayed in a hotel with Alexander Masekela. She spoke to her family on New Year's Eve. She was seen around the French Quarter. She left the hotel, leaving behind her passport, luggage, and personal belongings. A security guard later described a blonde woman entering the Mississippi River after saying, "I belong in water." Extensive searches recovered no body, no physical evidence, and no confirmation that the woman at the river was actually Eilenia Carisi. From that moment onward, every attempt to solve the mystery would begin with these same facts and confront the same unanswered questions. The incident itself lasted only a matter of days. Its consequences would endure for decades. When investigators begin examining a disappearance, the first objective is usually straightforward. Establish a reliable timeline, identify the last confirmed sighting, determine who interacted with the missing person, and search for physical evidence capable of explaining what happened. In many investigations, those first days produce the most valuable clues. Fresh memories, preserved evidence, and recent activity often allow detectives to reconstruct events with reasonable confidence. In the disappearance of Eilenia Carisi, however, the investigation quickly encountered a problem that would define the case for decades. Nearly every important question depended on information that could not be independently verified. Witnesses remembered fragments rather than complete sequences. Potential evidence pointed in different directions without confirming any of them. Most significantly, investigators never found a body, a confirmed crime scene, or forensic evidence establishing whether a crime had occurred at all. As a result, every theory remained possible, yet none could be proven. The investigation became less a process of confirming one explanation than eliminating those that could not withstand scrutiny, only to discover that several possibilities continued to survive. The first stage of the investigation focused on reconstructing Eilenia's final known movements in New Orleans. Detectives interviewed individuals who had seen her during the days before her disappearance, examined available hotel records, and attempted to establish exactly when she had last been observed with certainty. The Lewdale Hotel naturally became one of the first locations examined because it represented the last confirmed place where Eilenia had been staying. Investigators reviewed the circumstances surrounding her departure and paid particular attention to the man who had been sharing the room with her, Alexander Masakila. His statement formed one of the central pillars of the investigation because, according to the available evidence, he was among the last people known to have seen Eilenia before she disappeared. Masakila told investigators that the two had shared a hotel room, but slept in separate beds, and that Eilenia had left the hotel alone. At face value, his account appeared relatively simple. Yet simplicity did not eliminate suspicion. Detectives had a responsibility to determine whether his version of events could be independently supported or contradicted. As investigators looked more closely at Masakila's background, they discovered information that naturally intensified scrutiny. He had a criminal history involving drug-related offenses and violent behavior. Such findings did not establish guilt in Eilenia's disappearance, but they did provide investigators with legitimate reasons to examine his actions carefully. Criminal history is frequently considered during investigations because it may help identify patterns of behavior or possible motives. However, previous offenses are not evidence of involvement in a new case. Detectives therefore continued gathering information rather than drawing conclusions based solely on his past. Another detail soon attracted attention. After Eilenia disappeared, Masakila remained at the hotel instead of immediately leaving the area. More significantly, investigators learned that at one point he attempted to use Eilenia's traveler's checks to pay for his room. This action appeared suspicious. Traveler's checks are financial instruments belonging to their owner, and attempting to use another person's checks after that individual has disappeared understandably raised serious questions. Detectives examined this conduct carefully because it represented one of the few concrete actions documented after Eilenia's disappearance. Nevertheless, suspicion alone was insufficient to establish criminal responsibility. Investigators needed evidence demonstrating not merely questionable behavior, but direct involvement in Eilenia's disappearance. At one stage, Masakila was arrested in connection with an unrelated matter. This development provided investigators another opportunity to question him regarding Eilenia's disappearance. Yet despite extensive attention directed toward him, authorities ultimately reached the same conclusion that would characterize much of the investigation. There was insufficient evidence to prosecute him in connection with the missing person case. No blood was recovered linking him to violence. No forensic evidence connected him to a homicide. No eyewitness described witnessing an assault. No physical evidence established that Eilenia had died inside the hotel or anywhere else associated with him. Without those elements, prosecutors lacked the evidentiary foundation necessary to bring criminal charges. In legal systems governed by the principle of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, suspicion cannot substitute for evidence. Consequently, although Masakila remained a figure of public interest and family suspicion, the investigation could not establish his criminal responsibility for Eilenia's disappearance. While detectives examined Masakila's actions, they simultaneously evaluated the account provided by security guard Albert Cordova. His statement introduced the possibility that no homicide had occurred at all. According to his testimony, a blonde woman near the Mississippi River had entered the water voluntarily after saying, "I belong in water." If that woman truly was Eilenia, investigators faced a dramatically different explanation for the case. Rather than searching for evidence of murder, they would instead be investigating a possible suicide or accidental drowning. This became one of the principal investigative theories. Several factors appeared consistent with such a possibility. First, Cordova's account described a woman entering the river voluntarily rather than being forced into it. Second, after early January 1994, there was no verified evidence showing Eilenia using her passport, financial accounts, or official identification. The complete absence of confirmed activity over many years suggested that she had not continued in ordinary life elsewhere under her own identity. Eventually, Eilenia's father, Albanu, came to believe that she had died in the Mississippi River, accepting this explanation as the most likely interpretation of the available evidence. Yet investigators also recognized the profound weaknesses of the suicide theory. The most obvious limitation was the absence of physical confirmation. Despite search operations involving emergency responders and the Coast Guard, no body was recovered from the river. Without remains, forensic specialists could determine neither identity nor cause of death. No DNA evidence existed to support the conclusion that Eilenia had entered the river. Equally important, Albert Cordova himself never positively identified the woman he encountered as Eilenia Carisi. His description concerned a blonde woman, but countless individuals could fit such a general description. Investigators therefore confronted an uncomfortable reality. The theory depended almost entirely upon accepting that the unidentified woman at the river was Eilenia, since that identification could never be established through physical evidence. The explanation remained plausible but unproven. Thus, even the theory considered by some to be the most likely still rested upon uncertainty rather than confirmation. Another investigative direction centered on the possibility that Eilenia had been murdered. This theory gained attention for several reasons, not least because disappearances involving young travelers sometimes involve criminal acts that initially leave little evidence. Members of Eilenia's family, particularly her mother Romina Power, viewed this possibility seriously and expressed suspicions regarding Alexander Masekela. Their concerns reflected several documented facts. His criminal background was troubling. His attempt to use Eilenia's traveler's checks after her disappearance appeared suspicious. His failure to notify authorities immediately after she vanished also invited questions. These circumstances understandably caused investigators to examine him closely and contributed to continued public speculation. However, successful homicide prosecutions require evidence capable of establishing both the occurrence of a crime and the defendant's involvement in it. In Eilenia's case, investigators encountered critical deficiencies. No blood evidence indicated violence. No murder weapon was discovered. No witness described observing a physical attack. No crime scene containing forensic evidence could be identified. Most significantly, no body established that a homicide had actually occurred. Without these elements, investigators could not transform suspicion into proof. The murder theory, therefore, remained another possibility unsupported by sufficient evidence for prosecution. As months gradually became years, additional theories emerged beyond the immediate circumstances of New Orleans. One persistent possibility suggested that Eilenia had intentionally disappeared and begun a new life under another identity. Cases of voluntary disappearance, though uncommon, are not unheard of. Some individuals deliberately sever contact with family and friends for deeply personal reasons, establishing entirely new identities elsewhere. Public fascination with Eilenia's case encouraged numerous reports claiming that she had been seen alive in different locations. Rumors placed her in a convent in Arizona. Other reports suggested she had traveled to South America. Some speculated that she had simply chosen never to return to her previous life. Each alleged sighting briefly revived hope and generated renewed media attention. Yet every report shared the same ultimate outcome. Authorities examined available information, but none produced verifiable evidence confirming Eilenia's continued existence. No authenticated documents, photographs, fingerprints, or official records supported the claims. The rumors remained rumors, and investigators found no basis for concluding that she had voluntarily abandoned her identity. One reason investigators struggled to accept the voluntary disappearance theory involved the circumstances under which Eilenia left the hotel. According to the investigation, her passport and much of her personal property remained behind. For an international traveler intending to establish a new life elsewhere, abandoning essential identification would present substantial practical obstacles. This fact did not make voluntary disappearance impossible, but complicated the theory considerably. Detectives therefore treated the rumors cautiously, recognizing that extraordinary claims require reliable evidence. Despite repeated speculation over the years, none of the alleged sightings survived careful examination. The case remained exactly where it had begun. No confirmed trace of Eilenia existed after early January 1994. Another theory briefly attracted public attention because it appeared to offer a potential explanation involving a known violent offender. At one stage, speculation arose that Eilenia might have become a victim of serial killer Keith Hunter Jesperson. Such hypotheses are not unusual in famous missing person cases. When unidentified victims and notorious offenders intersect chronologically or geographically, investigators often compare available evidence to determine whether any connection exists. In this instance, authorities pursued the possibility through forensic testing. DNA analysis was conducted using unidentified remains that had been considered as possible matches. The results, however, excluded the connection. The DNA did not match Eilenia Carisi. Consequently, investigators abandoned the serial killer theory, rather than bringing the investigation closer to resolution. This development merely removed one possible explanation while leaving the central mystery intact. By this stage, the investigation had reached an increasingly frustrating pattern. Every theory contained elements that seemed plausible. Every theory also encountered decisive obstacles preventing confirmation. If Eilenia drowned in the Mississippi River, why was no body ever recovered? If she was murdered, where was the crime scene and what evidence established homicide? If she voluntarily disappeared, why abandon essential belongings and never produce verifiable evidence of continued life? If another offender was responsible, why had no forensic link ever emerged? Each hypothesis illuminated part of the mystery while leaving another part unexplained. Investigators eventually confronted a difficult but unavoidable conclusion. The available evidence was simply insufficient to determine with certainty what had happened. Cases built upon strong forensic foundations gradually narrow toward one explanation because physical evidence eliminates alternatives. The Carisi investigation moved in the opposite direction. The absence of decisive evidence allowed multiple explanations to coexist indefinitely. Every unanswered question preserved another possibility. Every missing piece of evidence prevented investigators from excluding competing theories. This state of uncertainty became the defining characteristic of the entire case. For Eilenia's family, the investigation's inability to reach a definitive conclusion carried consequences extending far beyond legal procedure. Without confirmation, there could be no final explanation, no established cause of death, and no complete understanding of her final moments. Instead, investigators, relatives, and the public remained suspended between competing possibilities, each supported by fragments of evidence, yet weakened by equally significant gaps. As years passed, the official investigation slowed, not because authorities had solved the mystery, but because every available lead had been pursued without producing conclusive answers. The file remained open in history, if not in active investigation, its pages filled with interviews, witness statements, theories, and unanswered questions. More than any single suspect or hypothesis. It was this absence of certainty that transformed Ilenia Carisi's disappearance into one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries connecting Italy and the United States. Every path investigators followed ultimately returned them to the same place, the moment a young traveler walked away, leaving behind her passport, her belongings, and a silence that no investigation has yet been able to break. As the months following Ilenia Carisi's disappearance gradually turned into years, the nature of investigation changed. In the beginning, investigators searched for evidence that might explain what had happened during those final days in New Orleans. Every interview, every witness statement, and every reported sighting carried the possibility of providing the breakthrough that missing person investigations often depend upon. Over time, however, those opportunities became increasingly rare. Memories faded. Witnesses became more difficult to locate. Potential evidence that might once have existed was no longer available. The investigation did not arrive at a definitive conclusion. Instead, it slowly entered the difficult territory familiar to many long-term missing person cases, a place where questions remain active long after meaningful new evidence has stopped appearing. Unlike criminal cases that culminate in arrests or trials, this investigation remains suspended between competing possibilities. No single explanation could satisfy every known fact, and no alternative possessed enough evidence to eliminate the others. The uncertainty that had characterized the investigation from its earliest days continued to define it, affecting not only investigators, but also the people whose lives had been permanently changed by Ilenia's disappearance. One of the most painful consequences of an unresolved disappearance is that time does not necessarily provide clarity. In many forms of loss, painful certainty eventually replaces uncertainty. Families mourn because they know what has happened, even if accepting that reality requires enormous emotional strength. In cases like Ilenia's, certainty never arrives. Every year that passes without answers creates an unusual emotional burden. Hope becomes more difficult to maintain, yet impossible to abandon completely. Acceptance offers practical relief in some respects, but risks feeling like surrender in others. Families often find themselves living between those two emotional realities, unable to move entirely toward either one. Ilenia's disappearance illustrates this struggle in a particularly visible way because of the different conclusions eventually reached by her parents. From the available evidence, Ilenia's father, Albanu Carisi, gradually came to believe that the explanation involving the Mississippi River was the most likely account of his daughter's fate. This belief was based not on forensic confirmation, but on the circumstances available to investigators. The testimony of Albert Cordova described a young blonde woman entering the river after speaking the words, "I belong in water." Although that witness could never positively identify the woman as Ilenia, no verified evidence ever emerged showing that Ilenia had remained alive after early January 1994. There were no confirmed financial transactions under her identity, no verified use of her official documents, no authenticated communication with family members, and no confirmed sightings capable of withstanding careful investigation. Faced with decades of silence, Albanu concluded that his daughter had most likely died on the night of her disappearance. It was not a conclusion supported by physical proof. Rather, it represented his personal acceptance of what he believed to be the most probable explanation among several unresolved possibilities. His position reflected a difficult reality confronted by many relatives of missing persons. At some point, the absence of evidence may itself begin to shape belief. When years pass without any reliable indication that a loved one remains alive, Some family members eventually conclude that continuing to expect their return no longer corresponds with the available facts. Such acceptance is rarely simple or free from emotional conflict. Instead, it often represents an attempt to find stability within circumstances that refuse to provide definitive answers. For Albanu, believing that Eilenia had died in the Mississippi River may have offered a painful form of closure, even though official certainty remained impossible. Eilenia's mother, Romina Power, reached a profoundly different conclusion. Throughout the years following the disappearance, she continued expressing hope that her daughter might still be alive. Rather than accepting the river theory, she maintained that the absence of a body and the absence of definitive forensic evidence left open the possibility that Eilenia had survived. She continued appealing for information, encouraging anyone with credible knowledge to come forward. Her position reflected another common response among families confronting unresolved disappearances. Without confirmation of death, hope can remain remarkably resilient. Every unanswered question becomes another reason to continue searching. Every unidentified possibility becomes another opportunity to believe that the missing person may one day return. The difference between Albanu and Romina was never simply a disagreement over investigative theory. It represented two fundamentally different ways of coping with prolonged uncertainty. One parent attempted to reconcile the available evidence by accepting the explanation that appeared, most probable despite its limitations. The other refused to abandon hope while any meaningful uncertainty remained. Neither perspective could be disproven because neither rested upon conclusive evidence. That is one of the cruelest aspects of unresolved disappearances. They often deny families the certainty required to grieve together. Instead, each individual is left to construct an understanding of events from the same incomplete collection of facts, sometimes arriving at entirely different emotional destinations. As public interest in the case continued over the years, rumors repeatedly complicated the family's experience. Reports occasionally surfaced claiming that Eilenia had been seen somewhere in the United States or elsewhere in the world. Stories placed her in locations including a convent in Arizona or suggested she had established a new life in South America under another identity. Each report briefly revived public discussion and generated renewed speculation. Yet investigators consistently examined such claims with caution. Every reported sighting required verification through evidence rather than assumption. In every instance, the rumors ultimately failed to produce reliable confirmation. No verified documents, no authenticated photographs, no official records, and no forensic evidence established that Eilenia remained alive. Consequently, the investigation always returned to the same unresolved position. The rumors neither solved the mystery nor substantially advanced the case. Instead, they illustrated another burden frequently carried by families of missing persons. Every unverified report has the potential to reopen emotional wounds, creating hope that may ultimately prove unfounded. Years continued to pass without meaningful developments. Investigators had already examined the principal theories surrounding the disappearance. The possibility of suicide remained unconfirmed because no body had been recovered and no evidence established that the unidentified woman at the Mississippi River was definitely Eilenia. The murder theory remained unsupported by sufficient forensic or testimonial evidence. Reports suggesting voluntary disappearance failed verification. Even speculation connecting the case to serial killer Keith Hunter Jesperson had been eliminated. Through DNA testing, the investigation had not solved the mystery. Instead, it had gradually excluded certain explanations while leaving several others unresolved. This distinction is important because eliminating possibilities is not the same as establishing truth. The investigation narrowed the field without ever reaching certainty. By 2014, 20 years had passed since Eilenia disappeared. During that period, no confirmed trace of her had emerged. Faced with this prolonged absence, legal questions inevitably arose. Modern legal systems must sometimes address situations in which individuals disappear for extended periods without definitive evidence of death. Families encounter practical issues involving property, inheritance, financial responsibilities, and numerous other legal matters that cannot remain unresolved indefinitely. Courts therefore possess procedures allowing a missing person to be declared legally presumed dead after specific conditions have been met. Such declarations are administrative and legal decisions rather than forensic conclusions. They address practical realities created by prolonged disappearance, not the factual circumstances surrounding the person's fate. In 2014, an Italian court declared Eilenia Carisi legally presumed dead following a request made by her father. This decision has occasionally been misunderstood as an official determination that investigators had solved the case. In reality, the declaration established no new evidence concerning what had happened in New Orleans. The court did not identify a cause of death. It did not determine the location of death. It did not identify a responsible individual or conclude that a crime had occurred. Nor did it establish that the unidentified woman seen by Albert Cordova had definitely been Eilenia. Instead, the declaration reflected the legal recognition that more than 2 decades had passed without any confirmed evidence that she remained alive. The distinction between legal presumption and factual certainty is essential. Courts routinely apply legal presumptions when practical administration requires resolution despite incomplete evidence. In Eilenia's case, the declaration allowed legal matters to proceed, but it did not answer the questions that investigators had been asking since January 1994. Her body had never been recovered. No forensic examination had ever established the circumstances of her death. No DNA evidence confirmed the river theory. No criminal prosecution had ever taken place because no suspect could be charged on the basis of the available evidence. The legal declaration therefore resolved administrative issues while leaving the historical mystery entirely intact. The absence of a trial also distinguishes this case from many well-known true crime investigations. There was no courtroom in which prosecutors presented a complete narrative supported by witnesses and forensic evidence. No defense challenged those allegations before a jury. No verdict established guilt or innocence. The criminal justice system never reached that stage because investigators lacked the evidence necessary to bring charges against any individual. Although Alexander Masekela remained the subject of public suspicion and family concern, suspicion alone cannot support prosecution. Legal systems built upon the presumption of innocence require evidence capable of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In Eilenia's case, that evidentiary threshold was never reached. Consequently, the legal outcome of the investigation was unusual but entirely consistent with the available facts. The disappearance remained officially unresolved. No homicide conviction was obtained because no homicide could be established. No suicide determination was formally confirmed because no remains were available for forensic examination. No finding of voluntary disappearance could be supported because no verified evidence demonstrated that Eilenia intentionally began a new life elsewhere. Instead, the only definitive legal action occurred 20 years later, when the Italian court recognized the practical consequences of her prolonged absence through a declaration of presumed death. For the public, legal proceedings often create the expectation that every mystery will eventually produce a final answer. Courtrooms are places where evidence is examined, testimony is evaluated, and conclusions are formally recorded. Yet some investigations never arrive there. They remain suspended indefinitely because the available evidence cannot satisfy the legal standards required for criminal prosecution or definitive factual findings. Ilenia Carisi's disappearance belongs to that difficult category. The legal system ultimately acknowledged her absence, but it could not explain it. The investigation documented possibilities, but it could not transform any one of them into established historical truth. By the time the court issued its declaration in 2014, more than 2 decades had passed since a young literature student left her hotel in New Orleans, leaving behind her passport, her belongings, and a trail that would end in uncertainty. The legal record could now state that she was presumed dead. It could not say how she died, where she died, or whether another person had played any role in her disappearance. Those questions remained exactly where investigators had first encountered them in January 1994, waiting for evidence that, despite the passage of time, has never been found. More than 3 decades have passed since Ilenia Carisi disappeared in New Orleans. Yet the essential facts of the case remain remarkably unchanged. Time has altered the world in countless ways. Technologies once unavailable to investigators have transformed modern criminal investigations. DNA analysis has become increasingly sophisticated. Digital records now preserve movements and communications with extraordinary precision. Surveillance cameras have become common in cities across the world. Mobile phones routinely document the smallest details of daily life. If a similar disappearance occurred today, investigators would likely possess access to far more information than was available during the first days of January 1994. Yet history cannot be investigated with evidence that never existed. The questions surrounding Ilenia's disappearance continue to depend upon the same witness statements, the same documented facts, and the same absence of physical evidence that confronted investigators from the very beginning. Despite the passage of time, no discovery has fundamentally changed the case. No new witness has emerged with verifiable information capable of resolving the mystery. No physical evidence has been recovered to establish what happened after Ilenia left the Ludale Hotel. No confirmed trace has demonstrated that she survived beyond those final documented days. The case remains suspended between possibility and certainty, occupying a place that few investigations ever escape. Perhaps the most persistent question concerns the unidentified woman seen beside the Mississippi River. Albert Cordova's testimony has remained one of the defining elements of the investigation because it appears to offer the final moments of someone who may have been Ilenia. According to his account, the young blonde woman calmly responded, "I belong in water," before entering the river. Those words have echoed through decades of media coverage, documentaries, and public discussion. Yet the significance of the statement depends entirely upon one unresolved issue: whether the woman Cordova encountered was actually Ilenia Carisi. Officially, that question has never been answered. There was no positive identification, no recovered personal belongings at the riverbank connecting Ilenia to the scene, no surveillance footage, and no forensic evidence capable of confirming the witness's observation. As a result, investigators could neither fully accept nor completely dismiss the account. It remains an important piece of testimony. But testimony alone cannot establish historical certainty. The distinction may appear subtle, yet it lies at the heart of the entire case. If the woman was Ilenia, investigators must explain why the Mississippi River never returned physical evidence confirming her death. If the woman was someone else, then Ilenia's final destination remains entirely unknown. One unanswered identification therefore produces 2 completely different investigative paths, neither of which can presently be confirmed. Closely connected to that uncertainty is another question that has challenged investigators from the beginning. Why were Ilenia's passport, luggage, and many of her personal belongings left behind? In any missing person investigation, Abandoned possessions naturally become objects of careful scrutiny because they may reveal intentions, interrupted plans, or unexpected events. In Eilenia's case, however, the evidence remains open to multiple interpretations. Leaving behind a passport appears inconsistent with the practical requirements of international travel. At the same time, investigators could not determine whether she intended to travel elsewhere that day or merely expected to return to the hotel. Without additional evidence, even seemingly important objects refuse to reveal their meaning. They remain silent witnesses whose existence is undisputed, but whose significance cannot be determined with confidence. This illustrates one of the most frustrating characteristics of unresolved investigations. Evidence does not always speak clearly. Sometimes it merely presents another question. Alexander Masekela also remains one of the central unresolved figures in the public imagination surrounding the case. His criminal history, his attempt to use Eilenia's traveler's checks after her disappearance, and his position as one of the last known individuals to have seen her naturally attracted investigators' attention. These facts justified careful examination and continue to prompt discussion whenever the case is revisited. It is equally important to distinguish between suspicion and proof. Throughout the investigation, authorities searched for evidence connecting him directly to Eilenia's disappearance. They found none sufficient to support criminal charges. No forensic evidence established that violence had occurred. No witness described seeing him assault Eilenia. No body was recovered. No crime scene was identified. Consequently, while questions concerning his knowledge of events have persisted in public discussion, the legal record remains unchanged. The investigation did not produce evidence capable of proving his involvement in any responsible examination of an unsolved case. Acknowledging the limits of available evidence is as important as examining the evidence itself. Unanswered questions should not be mistaken for established conclusions. The investigation also reminds us of the profound differences between disappearances and confirmed homicide cases. In many criminal investigations, physical evidence gradually narrows the range of possibilities. Fingerprints identify suspects. DNA establishes contact. Ballistics connect weapons to crimes. Surveillance footage reconstructs timelines. Eventually, investigators often reach a point where competing explanations become impossible because objective evidence supports one conclusion while excluding others. Missing person investigations frequently unfold very differently. Instead of accumulating certainty, they sometimes accumulate uncertainty. Every year, without new evidence makes reconstruction more difficult. Memories become less reliable. Potential witnesses move away or pass on. Physical evidence that might once have existed may disappear forever. Investigators are left preserving what remains while recognizing that the most important piece of evidence, the missing individual, has never been found. For families, this uncertainty creates a unique form of grief that differs profoundly from other kinds of loss. The disappearance of a loved one rarely provides a clear moment at which mourning begins. Instead, hope and sorrow often exist simultaneously. Every telephone call, every reported sighting, every anonymous letter, every rumor possesses the power to revive possibilities that had almost faded. Yet each unconfirmed lead also carries the risk of renewed disappointment. The Carisi family experienced this reality repeatedly as reports surfaced over the years claiming that Eilenia had been seen in different locations. Each rumor invited renewed attention, renewed investigation, and renewed emotional investment before ultimately proving unsupported by evidence. Such experiences demonstrate that unresolved disappearances affect families long after public attention has shifted elsewhere. The investigation may slow, but uncertainty remains a constant presence in everyday life. The differing perspectives of Albanu and Romina Power further illustrate how unresolved evidence can shape personal understanding in dramatically different ways. One parent eventually accepted that the available facts most likely pointed toward Eilenia's death in the Mississippi River. The other continued believing that hope remained justified because no body had ever been found and no definitive proof of death existed. Neither response can be dismissed as irrational. Both emerge from the same collection of incomplete evidence. Their different conclusions reveal how uncertainty often resists universal interpretation. In the absence of definitive proof, people naturally seek meaning in the fragments available to them. Some find peace by accepting probability. Others continue searching because possibility has not been eliminated. The investigation could not resolve that emotional divide because it never produced the certainty capable of ending it. In 2014, the Italian court's declaration that Eilenia was legally presumed dead addressed practical legal matters but did not resolve the historical mystery. That distinction remains essential when considering the case today. Legal systems must occasionally recognize prolonged absence, even when factual certainty is impossible. Such decisions allow administrative issues to proceed, but they do not establish the circumstances surrounding disappearance or death. Eilenia's legal status changed. The unanswered questions did not. No cause of death was determined. No individual was held criminally responsible. No official explanation replaced the competing theories that investigators had considered for years. The declaration acknowledged that 2 decades had passed without confirmed evidence that Eilenia remained alive. It did not identify what happened during those final days in New Orleans. Looking back across the entire investigation, 5 questions continue to define the case more than any others. Was the woman who entered the Mississippi River truly Eilenia Carisi? If she was, why were no remains ever recovered despite search efforts? Why did Eilenia leave behind her passport and other personal belongings when she left the hotel? Did Alexander Masekela possess knowledge beyond what he shared with investigators? Or did suspicion arise simply because he happened to be among the last people known to have seen her? Finally, is it possible that Eilenia became the victim of circumstances that left almost no physical evidence at all? These questions remain unresolved not because investigators ignored them, but because the available evidence has never allowed definitive answers. The story of Eilenia Carisi ultimately stands as a reminder of the limitations of even the most determined investigations. Popular culture often portrays criminal inquiries as journeys that inevitably conclude with clear answers, dramatic confrontations, and courtroom verdicts. Reality is often less satisfying. Some investigations end not with certainty, but with carefully documented uncertainty. Detectives can only analyze the evidence that exists. They cannot reconstruct events that left no trace. Courts can only evaluate facts presented before them. They cannot convict on suspicion alone. Families can only make sense of the information available, even when that information remains painfully incomplete. Eilenia's disappearance embodies each of these realities. It is not remembered because investigators failed to care or because authorities abandoned the search. Rather, it is remembered because despite years of inquiry, the evidence never reached the threshold necessary to explain what truly happened. There is a quiet tragedy in the contrast between the journey Eilenia intended to make and the legacy that followed. She set out to experience the world independently, hoping that travel would provide the inspiration for a future novel. Literature had taught her that every life contains stories worth telling, and she sought those stories through direct experience rather than inherited fame. Instead, history transformed her own life into a story defined not by the pages she hoped to write, but by the pages investigators could never complete. The narrative she intended to author became one that others have spent decades trying to understand, always beginning with the same known facts and always ending with the same unanswered questions. The Mississippi River continues flowing through New Orleans just as it did on that winter night in January 1994. Visitors still walk along its banks, unaware that one of the city's most enduring mysteries is tied to those waters. The French Quarter remains filled with music, conversation, and travelers arriving from every corner of the world. Life has continued, as it always does. Yet somewhere within the history of that city remains the unexplained disappearance of a 23-year-old Italian traveler whose final documented days have never been fully understood. Whether the truth lies beneath the waters of the Mississippi, within an event that left no surviving evidence, or in circumstances that investigators were never able to uncover, one fact remains beyond dispute. Eilenia Maria Sol Carisi has never been found. More than 30 years after she vanished, despite extensive investigation, multiple theories, international attention, and decades of public interest, her disappearance remains officially unresolved. The silence that began in New Orleans in January 1994 has never truly ended. And until evidence emerges capable of answering the questions left behind, the mystery of Eilenia Carisi will remain one of the most enduring unsolved missing person cases linking Italy and the United States. There are investigations that end with a confession. Others conclude with forensic evidence so overwhelming that every uncertainty disappears inside a courtroom. Then there are cases like that of Eilenia Carisi, where the passing of time changes almost everything except the central mystery itself. More than 30 years have elapsed since a 23-year-old Italian traveler vanished in New Orleans. Yet the questions surrounding her disappearance remain almost exactly as they were in January 1994. New technologies have reshaped criminal investigations around the world. DNA analysis has become increasingly precise. Digital databases allow investigators to compare fingerprints, unidentified remains, and missing person records across jurisdictions with a speed unimaginable in the early 1990s. Surveillance cameras now document countless public spaces. Mobile phones continuously generate location records, photographs, messages, and electronic footprints. Modern investigators frequently reconstruct the final hours of a missing person through thousands of pieces of digital evidence. Yet none of those advances can create information that was never recorded. They cannot recover conversations that left no witnesses, produce surveillance footage from cameras that did not exist, or identify a body that has never been found. The disappearance of Eilenia Carisi remains tied to the evidence available at the time, and that evidence continues to resist every attempt to transform possibility into certainty. Looking back across the entire chronology, what makes this case so remarkable is not the number of facts investigators possess, but the extraordinary influence of a handful of unresolved details. The entire mystery turns upon several moments, each separated by uncertainty. A young woman decides to travel around the world in search of experiences that might one day become literature. She spends months moving through Central America before arriving in New Orleans. She shares a hotel room with a street musician who later becomes a significant figure in the investigation. She telephones her family on New Year's Eve. She leaves the hotel, abandoning her passport and many of her belongings. A security guard later reports seeing a blonde woman enter the Mississippi River after saying, "I belong in water." Search teams fail to recover a body. From that point onward, history becomes silent. Every discussion, every documentary, every newspaper article, every renewed investigation eventually circles back to those same moments because nothing definitively replaced them. One of the reasons this disappearance continues attracting attention is that each major theory appears convincing until examined more closely. The possibility that Eilenia died in the Mississippi River seems supported by the security guards' testimony and by the complete absence of verified evidence showing that she remained alive after January 1994. Yet the theory immediately encounters its greatest weakness. The witness could not positively identify the woman he saw. No physical evidence connected Eilenia to the riverbank. No remains were recovered despite search efforts. Without those elements, investigators could not elevate probability into certainty. The murder theory likewise possesses circumstances that naturally invite suspicion. Alexander Masekela's criminal history, his attempt to use Eilenia's traveler's checks after she disappeared, and his position as one of the last people known to have seen her understandably drew investigative attention. However, criminal investigations ultimately depend upon evidence rather than suspicion. No blood connected him to an act of violence. No witness observed an assault. No crime scene was identified. No body established that homicide had occurred. Investigators, therefore, found themselves unable to move beyond suspicion toward prosecution. The possibility that Eilenia intentionally disappeared appears equally difficult to dismiss at first glance. Throughout history, individuals have occasionally abandoned their former lives and begun new ones under different identities. Rumors placing Eilenia in Arizona, South America, or elsewhere reflected that possibility. Yet every reported sighting failed verification. More importantly, leaving behind a passport and other personal belongings seems inconsistent with the practical realities of beginning a completely new international life. Again, certainty remained beyond reach. Every explanation addressed some questions while creating new ones. That balance has never fundamentally changed. Another striking feature of the case is the contrast between legal resolution and factual resolution. In 2014, an Italian court declared Eilenia legally presumed dead after more than 20 years without verified evidence that she remained alive. Such declarations exist because legal systems cannot leave practical matters unresolved indefinitely. Property, inheritance, administrative responsibilities, and numerous legal relationships require final decisions, even when complete certainty remains impossible. Yet a declaration of presumed death should never be mistaken for a solved investigation. The court did not determine where Eilenia died. It did not identify how she died. It did not conclude whether another individual was responsible. It simply acknowledged that the prolonged absence satisfied the legal requirements for presuming death. The historical mystery remained untouched. For many observers unfamiliar with missing person investigations, this distinction is easily overlooked. Yet it illustrates an important reality. Courts resolve legal questions according to legal standards. Investigators seek historical truth through evidence. Occasionally, those two processes arrive at the same conclusion. Sometimes they do not. Eilenia's case belongs firmly in the second category. Equally significant is the way this disappearance has continued affecting those closest to her. Public attention naturally focuses upon investigators, suspects, and theories. But behind every missing person investigation stands a family required to live with uncertainty that rarely diminishes over time. The difference between Al Banu and Romina Power's responses demonstrates how profoundly unresolved evidence shapes grief. One parent eventually concluded that accepting the Mississippi River explanation represented the most realistic interpretation of the available facts. The other continued believing that hope remained justified because no definitive proof of death existed. Their disagreement was never rooted in conflicting evidence. Both relied upon the same investigation, the same witness statements, and the same unanswered questions. What differed was how each interpreted uncertainty. One found peace by accepting probability. The other preserved hope because possibility remained alive. Neither response contradicts the evidence because the evidence itself never reached certainty. That emotional divide has become one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of the entire story. It reminds us that unsolved disappearances often continue long after investigative activity has slowed. Files may become inactive, but families continue living with unanswered questions every day. Looking back, it is impossible not to notice the profound irony within Eilenia's journey. She deliberately chose to step away from public attention despite belonging to one of Italy's most famous families. She pursued literature instead of celebrity, education instead of entertainment, experience instead of comfort. Selling most of her possessions to finance a journey around the world reflected a desire to encounter ordinary lives, unfamiliar cultures, and authentic stories. She hoped those experiences would eventually become the foundation of a novel. Instead, history transformed her own life into a story discussed across generations. Not because of fame inherited from her parents, but because of a disappearance that no one has been able to explain. The author became the mystery. The traveler became the unanswered question. The story she intended to write remained unwritten, while investigators, journalists, and historians have spent decades attempting to reconstruct the final chapter of her own. There's also a broader lesson within the investigation itself. Popular culture frequently portrays forensic science as nearly infallible, capable of solving every mystery given sufficient time. While scientific advances have indeed transformed criminal investigation, they remain dependent upon evidence. DNA analysis requires biological material. Fingerprint comparison requires fingerprints. Facial recognition requires images. None of these techniques can compensate for the complete absence of physical evidence. The Carisi investigation demonstrates that reality with unusual clarity. Investigators were not defeated by contradictory forensic results. They were challenged by the absence of definitive forensic evidence altogether. The case, therefore, serves as a reminder that even the most advanced investigative methods possess limitations. Science can analyze evidence that exists. It cannot create evidence where none survives. Perhaps that explains why the disappearance continues resonating with so many people decades later. Human beings naturally seek conclusions. Stories usually end with explanations that allow uncertainty to disappear. The Carisi case refuses to provide such comfort. Every generation examining the evidence encounters exactly the same unresolved questions that confronted investigators in 1994. Was the woman beside the Mississippi truly Eilenia? If so, why was no body ever recovered? If not, where did she go after leaving the hotel? Why were her passport and belongings left behind? Did Alexander Masekela know more than investigators could prove? Or did the truth vanish through circumstances that left almost no trace? None of those questions has acquired a definitive answer. They remain suspended exactly where investigators left them, awaiting evidence that has never emerged. Today, Eilenia Carisi's disappearance occupies a unique place among international missing person cases. It connects Italy and the United States through a mystery that has resisted decades of examination. It reminds investigators that not every file ends with certainty. It reminds families that hope and grief can coexist for years when evidence refuses to provide finality. Above all, it reminds us that behind every famous investigation stands a real person whose life extended far beyond the mystery that later defined public memory. Before she became the subject of headlines, documentaries, and unanswered questions, Eilenia was a young woman fascinated by literature, determined to explore the world on her own terms. That aspiration remains the last fully understood chapter of her story. Everything that followed belongs to uncertainty. Until new evidence appears, if it ever does. The disappearance of Eilenia Maria Sol Carisi will remain exactly what it has been for more than 3 decades. One of the most enduring, unsolved missing person mysteries involving both Italy and the United States. A case in which every confirmed fact has been examined repeatedly. Every major theory has been considered carefully. And yet the truth continues to exist somewhere beyond the reach of everyone who has searched for it. In every long-running missing person investigation, there comes a point where the factual record stops expanding, yet the public interest does not. The case of Eilenia Carisi reached that point decades ago. But what makes it distinctive is not only the absence of resolution, but the remarkable stability of its unresolved structure. The same core facts that defined the case in 1994 continue to define it today. A young Italian traveler, last confirmed in New Orleans, a hotel stay shared with a street musician, a final phone call to her family on New Year's Eve, a departure from the hotel, leaving behind essential belongings, including her passport, a period of uncertain sightings in the French Quarter, and a final contested witness account of a woman entering the Mississippi River. These elements have remained unchanged not because the investigation lacked attention, but because nothing discovered since has been strong enough to alter or replace them. The persistence of this static evidentiary foundation is itself unusual in modern missing person cases, where even cold investigations occasionally yield new forensic breakthroughs years later. In this instance, however, time has functioned less as an investigative tool and more as a stabilizing force, preserving uncertainty in its original form. Every theory built around the case must therefore begin and end with the same limitation: the absence of definitive physical evidence confirming either survival or death. This absence is not a minor gap in the record. It is the defining condition of the entire investigation. Without a body, without confirmed forensic traces, and without verified documentation of subsequent life, the case exists in a permanent state of interpretive tension where competing explanations cannot be conclusively resolved. The river hypothesis, the homicide hypothesis, and the voluntary disappearance hypothesis each attempt to impose narrative structure onto a sequence of incomplete observations. Yet none can eliminate the evidentiary weaknesses of the others. The river theory depends heavily on the testimony of a single witness who could not positively identify the woman he observed, and whose account, while detailed, lacks corroborating physical evidence. The homicide theory centers on circumstantial suspicion surrounding the last known associate of the missing person. Yet it fails to produce forensic indicators typically associated with violent crime, such as blood evidence, a crime scene, or a recovered body. The voluntary disappearance theory, while superficially consistent with the absence of further records, struggles against practical inconsistencies such as the abandonment of essential travel documents and a lack of any authenticated identity reappearance over 3 decades. What emerges from this comparison is not a hierarchy of likelihood supported by conclusive proof, but a triad of incomplete narratives, each structurally plausible within its own boundaries, yet incapable of fully accounting for the totality of known facts. This is why the investigation has resisted closure in a substantive sense even after its legal conclusion. The 2014 Italian court declaration that Eilenia is legally presumed dead did not arise from new evidence, but from administrative necessity after 20 years of unresolved absence. Legally, such declarations serve to resolve civil uncertainty, allowing families to address inheritance and legal status. They do not, however, constitute a forensic determination of events. The court did not establish how she died, where she died, or whether she died in the Mississippi River or elsewhere. It simply acknowledged that no verified evidence had emerged indicating that she was still alive. This distinction between legal resolution and factual resolution is central to understanding why the case continues to exist in public discourse long after its administrative closure. In the absence of physical proof, legal systems must eventually act on probability and time rather than certainty and evidence. But historical truth remains unaffected by such procedural necessity. Another enduring dimension of the case lies in its psychological and emotional structure, particularly within the family. The divergence between the perspectives of Eilenia's parents is not merely a difference of interpretation, but a reflection of how human beings adapt differently to unresolved ambiguity. One perspective moves toward closure by accepting the most consistent explanation available within the limits of evidence, even if that explanation remains unverified. The other resists closure entirely, preserving the possibility of survival because no definitive proof of death exists. Both positions are internally coherent because both are rooted in the same evidentiary uncertainty. The investigation itself never resolved this divergence because it lacked the capacity to do so. No additional fact could reconcile two emotional responses that depend not on different evidence, but on different relationships to uncertainty itself. This dynamic illustrates one of the most profound realities of missing person cases. They do not end simultaneously for everyone involved. For investigators, a case may become inactive when no further leads exist. For legal systems, it may conclude when procedural thresholds are met. But for families, it often continues indefinitely in a suspended emotional state where absence does not transform into certainty. The passage of time does not eliminate ambiguity. It simply extends its duration. Public fascination with the case has also played a role in sustaining its presence in collective memory. High-profile disappearances involving well-known families tend to attract enduring attention, particularly when they contain elements that resist straightforward explanation. In this case, the combination of international travel, celebrity association, and unresolved circumstances created a narrative structure that remains compelling precisely because it lacks closure. Yet sustained attention does not equate to investigative progress. Despite decades of discussion, speculation, and periodic media revisiting, no verifiable breakthrough has emerged that alters the foundational facts. Each renewed examination ultimately returns to the same evidentiary ceiling encountered by investigators in the 1990s: the absence of physical confirmation. This reinforces an important methodological point in investigative work. Public visibility can generate interest, but it cannot substitute for material evidence. The case remains unsolved not because it has been insufficiently discussed, but because the essential components required for resolution have never been recovered. In reflecting on the disappearance as a whole, it is also necessary to acknowledge the structural limitations inherent in reconstructing events that leave minimal trace. Human activity typically generates evidence, but not all evidence survives, and not all survival is detectable. A person may move through environments without creating records that persist beyond immediate observation. In 1994, before the widespread digitization of personal data, such gaps were even more common. Travel was documented primarily through physical records, eyewitness accounts, and institutional logs, all of which are vulnerable to loss, incompleteness, or absence. When those limited sources fail to converge on a single explanation, investigators are left with fragmented narratives that resist synthesis. The Carisi case exemplifies this condition with unusual clarity. It is not a mystery obscured by conflicting evidence, but one defined by insufficient evidence across all competing interpretations. Even the most significant witness statement in the case, the account of the Mississippi River incident, remains fundamentally unanchored without identification or physical corroboration. It exists as testimony, not confirmation, and testimony alone cannot resolve identity in forensic terms. This distinction continues to shape the case's unresolved status. Over time, as investigative avenues have been exhausted, the case has transitioned from an active inquiry into a historical unresolved file. Yet its interpretive openness has remained unchanged. New theories have emerged, but none have been able to surpass the evidentiary limitations that constrain the original investigation. This is why the case continues to be revisited not as a solvable puzzle awaiting a final piece, but as an example of the limits of investigative certainty itself. It demonstrates that even with multiple witnesses, international jurisdiction, and sustained attention, some events resist reconstruction because the necessary evidence no longer exists or was never created in the first place. Ultimately, the disappearance of Eilenia Carisi endures because it occupies a rare space between documentation and absence. There is enough information to suggest multiple plausible narratives, yet not enough to confirm any of them. The result is a case that remains perpetually open in interpretation even as it is closed in investigation. More than 3 decades later, the essential truth is not that the mystery has been partially solved or gradually clarified, but that it has remained structurally unchanged. The same questions persist without resolution, and the same facts continue to support multiple interpretations. In the absence of new evidence, the case cannot move forward, and without movement, it remains suspended in the state in which it began, an unexplained disappearance, defined by what is known, shaped by what is unknown, and ultimately preserved by the enduring silence of unanswered questions that time itself has been unable to resolve. In every long-running missing person investigation, there comes a point where the factual record stops expanding, yet the public interest does not. The case of Eilenia Carisi reached that point decades ago. But what makes it distinctive is not only the absence of resolution, but the remarkable stability of its unresolved structure. The same core facts that defined the case in 1994 continue to define it today. A young Italian traveler, last confirmed in New Orleans, a hotel stay shared with a street musician, a final phone call to her family on New Year's Eve, a departure from the hotel, leaving behind essential belongings, including her passport, a period of uncertain sightings in the French Quarter, and a final contested witness account of a woman entering the Mississippi River. These elements have remained unchanged not because the investigation lacked attention, but because nothing discovered since has been strong enough to alter or replace them. The persistence of this static evidentiary foundation is itself unusual in modern missing person cases, where even cold investigations occasionally yield new forensic breakthroughs years later. In this instance, however, time has functioned less as an investigative tool and more as a stabilizing force, preserving uncertainty in its original form. Every theory built around the case must therefore begin and end with the same limitation: the absence of definitive physical evidence confirming either survival or death. This absence is not a minor gap in the record. It is the defining condition of the entire investigation. Without a body, without confirmed forensic traces, and without verified documentation of subsequent life, the case exists in a permanent state of interpretive tension where competing explanations cannot be conclusively resolved. The river hypothesis, the homicide hypothesis, and the voluntary disappearance hypothesis each attempt to impose narrative structure onto a sequence of incomplete observations. Yet none can eliminate the evidentiary weaknesses of the others. The river theory depends heavily on the testimony of a single witness who could not positively identify the woman he observed, and whose account, while detailed, lacks corroborating physical evidence. The homicide theory centers on circumstantial suspicion surrounding the last known associate of the missing person. Yet it fails to produce forensic indicators typically associated with violent crime, such as blood evidence, a crime scene, or a recovered body. The voluntary disappearance theory, while superficially consistent with the absence of further records, struggles against practical inconsistencies such as the abandonment of essential travel documents and a lack of any authenticated identity reappearance over 3 decades. What emerges from this comparison is not a hierarchy of likelihood supported by conclusive proof, but a triad of incomplete narratives, each structurally plausible within its own boundaries, yet incapable of fully accounting for the totality of known facts. This is why the investigation has resisted closure in a substantive sense even after its legal conclusion. The 2014 Italian court declaration that Ilenia is legally presumed dead did not arise from new evidence, but from administrative necessity after 20 years of unresolved absence. Legally, such declarations serve to resolve civil uncertainty, allowing families to address inheritance and legal status. They do not, however, constitute a forensic determination of events. The court did not establish how she died, where she died, or whether she died in the Mississippi River or elsewhere. It simply acknowledged that no verified evidence had emerged indicating that she was still alive. This distinction between legal resolution and factual resolution is central to understanding why the case continues to exist in public discourse long after its administrative closure. In the absence of physical proof, legal systems must eventually act on probability and time rather than certainty and evidence. But historical truth remains unaffected by such procedural necessity. Another enduring dimension of the case lies in its psychological and emotional structure, particularly within the family. The divergence between the perspectives of Ilenia's parents is not merely a difference of interpretation, but a reflection of how human beings adapt differently to unresolved ambiguity. One perspective moves toward closure by accepting the most consistent explanation available within the limits of evidence, even if that explanation remains unverified. The other resists closure entirely, preserving the possibility of survival because no definitive proof of death exists. Both positions are internally coherent because both are rooted in the same evidentiary uncertainty. The investigation itself never resolved this divergence because it lacked the capacity to do so. No additional fact could reconcile two emotional responses that depend not on different evidence, but on different relationships to uncertainty itself. This dynamic illustrates one of the most profound realities of missing person cases. They do not end simultaneously for everyone involved. For investigators, a case may become inactive when no further leads exist. For legal systems, it may conclude when procedural thresholds are met. But for families, it often continues indefinitely in a suspended emotional state where absence does not transform into certainty. The passage of time does not eliminate ambiguity. It simply extends its duration. Public fascination with the case has also played a role in sustaining its presence in collective memory. High-profile disappearances involving well-known families tend to attract enduring attention, particularly when they contain elements that resist straightforward explanation. In this case, the combination of international travel, celebrity association, and unresolved circumstances created a narrative structure that remains compelling precisely because it lacks closure. Yet sustained attention does not equate to investigative progress. Despite decades of discussion, speculation, and periodic media revisiting, no verifiable breakthrough has emerged that alters the foundational facts. Each renewed examination ultimately returns to the same evidentiary ceiling encountered by investigators in the 1990s: the absence of physical confirmation. This reinforces an important methodological point in investigative work. Public visibility can generate interest, but it cannot substitute for material evidence. The case remains unsolved not because it has been insufficiently discussed, but because the essential components required for resolution have never been recovered. In reflecting on the disappearance as a whole, it is also necessary to acknowledge the structural limitations inherent in reconstructing events that leave minimal trace. Human activity typically generates evidence, but not all evidence survives, and not all survival is detectable. A person may move through environments without creating records that persist beyond immediate observation. In 1994, before the widespread digitization of personal data, such gaps were even more common. Travel was documented primarily through physical records, eyewitness accounts, and institutional logs, all of which are vulnerable to loss, incompleteness, or absence. When those limited sources fail to converge on a single explanation, investigators are left with fragmented narratives that resist synthesis. The Carisi case exemplifies this condition with unusual clarity. It is not a mystery obscured by conflicting evidence, but one defined by insufficient evidence across all competing interpretations. Even the most significant witness statement in the case, the account of the Mississippi River incident, remains fundamentally unanchored without identification or physical corroboration. It exists as testimony, not confirmation, and testimony alone cannot resolve identity in forensic terms. This distinction continues to shape the case's unresolved status. Over time, as investigative avenues have been exhausted, the case has transitioned from an active inquiry into a historical unresolved file. Yet its interpretive openness has remained unchanged. New theories have emerged, but none have been able to surpass the evidentiary limitations that constrain the original investigation. This is why the case continues to be revisited not as a solvable puzzle awaiting a final piece, but as an example of the limits of investigative certainty itself. It demonstrates that even with multiple witnesses, international jurisdiction, and sustained attention, some events resist reconstruction because the necessary evidence no longer exists or was never created in the first place. Ultimately, the disappearance of Eilenia Carisi endures because it occupies a rare space between documentation and absence. There is enough information to suggest multiple plausible narratives, yet not enough to confirm any of them. The result is a case that remains perpetually open in interpretation even as it is closed in investigation. More than 3 decades later, the essential truth is not that the mystery has been partially solved or gradually clarified, but that it has remained structurally unchanged. The same questions persist without resolution, and the same facts continue to support multiple interpretations. In the absence of new evidence, the case cannot move forward, and without movement, it remains suspended in the state in which it began, an unexplained disappearance, defined by what is known, shaped by what is unknown, and ultimately preserved by the enduring silence of unanswered questions that time itself has been unable to resolve.